Perfect. So if it's okay, I'm going to start the amazing Meet the Author session that we've got today, which is with Glenn Loveland, who you will be able to see. He's highlighted on your screen. I'm really delighted to have Glenn. Glenn is a global HR expert that has got a wealth of China experience and actually lived in Beijing from 2007 till 2020. He's worked for some really interesting companies that I'm sure everyone is going to have heard of, which are Walt Disney in China, Pearson, and then CGTN, which is actually part of the China State Broadcasting company, which I'm really excited to ask questions about that going forward. So let me just double check. I think I've clicked to transcribe the meeting rather than to record it. So let me just check that I've...
Mine says recording and transcription. So
Okay, so I don't think we need the transcription, so I'll stop that just so it's not clicking on my screen. But there we go. We're still recording, so that's all going well. So Glenn, thank you so much for coming today.
I want to thank the Confucius Institute, Linda, Jack. Thank you all for providing this platform. This is the first time I've given a talk about Beijing Bound, and I'm so excited that it's an international talk too, because I think that's very much the spirit of Beijing. It's an international city.
Awesome. Yeah, fantastic. I should mention the main reason that we've got you here is you have just published your first book. We had a little chat about it before everyone joined, and so it wasn't in my mind. But yeah, Glenn has published his first book, which is called Beijing Bound, which is a memoir and travelogue that talks about his experiences in Beijing, which include the pre-Olympic fever, lots of different workplace scenarios and interesting nights and travel adventures. And so in the structure of today's event, which is going to be around about 6 till 7:30, we're going to have 3 different sections, if that is okay with everyone. To begin with, we're just going to talk with Glenn about who he is, his experiences and his experiences in China. We're then going to do a section on his book, Beijing Bound. And then we're going to move on to a really exciting section that I think will interest lots of our students that will be in the call, which is Glenn is going to talk about his experiences as a HR expert in China. He's going to give some career advice, which of course all of our students, especially our final years, will be interested in, hoping to go on to get employment after they graduate. And then we're just going to, at the end, fit in a question and answer session. So if that is okay with everyone, I have some questions prepared for Glenn. So we will start with just an introduction about yourself and your personal journey. I've got the first question here, but I wondered, did you want to start by just telling us about yourself, a brief introduction?
Yeah, no, thank you, Jack. And I also just wanted to say I love interactive chat. So as people have questions, I don't know how we're doing that, if there's a chat or whatever, but drop them in because I think that's always wonderful. But so yeah, my home state is New Mexico here in the United States. After college, I moved to Washington, D.C. I was a congressional staffer. I was a press secretary, and so I really got into public relations, PR, worked on the Hill for 7 years. This was during the George W. Bush era. And I got really tired of the politics in DC. I felt like we weren't getting anything done. It's so funny because I look back at that period now, and actually it seems much better than how DC is run today. But I just decided I wanted to do something else. And I was not an international person at all. Like we used to spend, I traveled to Canada, I traveled to Mexico, Australia. But when I was looking at the world, China just seemed like the most logical place to go. I knew nothing about it, didn't speak Mandarin, didn't really eat Chinese food even, but China was on the rise. And I just decided I want to move to China. And that really forms the core story in my book, Beijing Bound. I tried starting to write it when I was in Beijing, actually, and I felt like I couldn't write about China while I was in China. It was very challenging. So there is a chapter in the book called More Than This, and it's about when I'm in DC and I decide to move to China. And that chapter I actually wrote from Beijing. The rest of the book was written in the United States.
Awesome. So you're working in the USA in Washington. Oh, sorry, someone's just joining. Let me admit them. And then you moved to China in 2007, which I think that's such a big cultural change to go from kind of the capital of American politics to the capital of China politics. But more than that, like you say, food, environment, there's lots of cultural differences. What are some of the things that you found? Any interesting stories? Did you get any whiplash from that?
Someone said to me at one point, they were like, when you're an American and you're going to Asia for the first time, it kind of feels like you've been, dropped on the moon a little bit, right? I think what I noticed at the beginning, when you're new to China, you focus on all those things that you're not used to, right? So it's like, okay, everyone uses chopsticks, and this is the decorum in a restaurant, or how you act with colleagues. You focus on the surface things. And this book has a lot of those surface issues. I think the fascinating things are the things that we can't see, those cultural insights that, I moved to China nearly 20 years ago, and I'm just now realizing some things about Chinese culture that I really appreciate. And I think that'll keep going on the rest of my life. So Beijing Bound has a lot of those fish out of water stories. And I did write it thinking maybe, a language student that's moving to China for the first time and really wants to immerse in a Mandarin environment. I kind of wrote it for them too, so that they would have a little bit of a guidebook that I didn't necessarily have.
Sure. Yeah. Awesome. Can you think of one of those examples of those stories of big cultural shock?
God, I honestly, the first night, my boss, the company, they picked me up and they said, we're going to dinner. And, the driving I found very chaotic. I was like, oh my gosh, like we almost hit that lady on the bike. And I remember people were so patient. I was like, wow, Chinese people are so patient. Like I knew in like a place like New York or London, people would be yelling and fighting with the driver, and there people were just calm and patient. But I remember in the restaurant, we went to a Sichuan restaurant. I grew up in New Mexico. I love spicy food. Of course, Sichuan style is different. But our driver was ordering food with the waitress. And then the waitress comes back with a bag, and the bag is moving. And they open the bag, and it's a live fish. And I realized that we're about to eat that fish, and the driver's inspecting it. And he's like, yeah, that one looks good. For me, that was a huge culture shock. Americans are kind of sensitive and animals and all that kind of thing. And it's so funny because, within a couple of years, I was so used to going to like a hot pot restaurant that has all the fish tanks at the front. And then you walk over and you're like, I want that one. But for me, that was a shocking moment.
Sure. Yeah. No, absolutely. I think food preparation is something that is different from country to country. I can remember when I first arrived in China, a kind of cultural shock for myself when I got out of the taxi to my university was there was a street vendor cooking some stinky tofu,
Yeah.
which, as its name probably suggests, he dropped me off outside the street vendor and I smelt this for the first time and I didn't really know what it was. So I was a little bit confused and thought, is that the smell that's going to be everywhere? Only to later found out a couple of weeks later, one of my friends introduced me, oh, this is stinky tofu. This is a delicacy.
My stinky tofu story, I never actually ate that in Beijing, but I went to Hunan province and I love the food in Hunan. I mean, Hunan, I think, is such a hidden gem in China, honestly. And I ate it in Hunan and I was like, this is divine. And like, I just felt like they made it the right way and it was addictive.
Yeah. So am I right in thinking you arrived in Beijing in 2007, and that is 1 year before the Summer Olympics in 2008? So that, for me personally, was such a pivotal part of my childhood and of how I came to understand China, and a very positive influence on what my first kind of understanding of China was. And I know it was a huge part of China itself, the country, on a global stage, of how it presented itself to the world. And I think, I have some of my colleagues in here. They speak very fondly about the memory of Beijing 2008. So I'm just curious, what was it like being in China in 2007? The build up to the preparations. What did it feel like?
It was an amazing time. And I did not write this book for myself. I really wrote the book because I thought that period, 2007, 2008, that was not only a shining moment for China, but really for the world, I think. And I cannot convey the excitement in that buildup and the pride of the Chinese people. I mean, they saw hotels are getting built, taxi drivers were trying to learn some Chinese phrases. I had British English has always been more popular in China, I would say, than American English. And the driver was, showing me the word boot, on the car. And I'm like, oh, Americans call this trunk, but it was really cute to me that like people were they were just so much pride. Everyone was, improving their English. There were all these campaigns to cut down and like make people quote unquote civilized, spitting. It's a common thing in like traditional Chinese medicine. If you've got something yucky in your body, you don't want to ingest it and keep it in your body, so you expel it. Government had a lot of campaigns on that, but it was a glowing time, and I really wrote it thinking maybe a Chinese person that wasn't there 20 years from now, maybe they can find this book and be like, wow, this was so impactful to this guy. He wrote a book about it.
Yeah. So you worked at CGTN, which is part of CCTV. Am I right in thinking, I think the Dakucha, the building that we talked about, that you had the pleasure of working at, and is a real symbol of Beijing. If I'm right, I think that was actually built for those Olympics and opened for 2008.
Yeah, that construction, it hadn't fully, construction was still ongoing. I think they completed it. There was a fire, I think in early 2009 that kind of delayed things. But the CCTV tower in the CBD is definitely part of that whole experience, that whole genesis. And it was just such China was doing so many exciting things with architecture, the bird's nest, the water cube. Some of these things I think are a little cutting edge, and I know China is trying to go, scale things back a little bit from that height. But I will say, I write about this in the book. Wired magazine, which is an American magazine that focuses on tech and futurism, in 2006, they did a story showing these advanced Chinese cities. And I saw these photos and I'm like, I want to live there. And I look today at what's going on. China's the leader in renewable energy, Chinese electric vehicles. Like in Australia, so many people have EVs. China now, I think it's less about fancy buildings, but they've really embraced that clean tech. It's so exciting.
Yeah, I think everyone would agree that technology in China has come on absolute leaps and bounds, and people's day-to-day experiences when they think back to 5 years previous or 10 years previous, it's completely changed. Which brings me on to a question. I'm kind of curious. So when you land in Beijing in 2007, can you remember what day-to-day life was like? So, for example, as a foreigner landing in China, did you have WeChat? Did you have a smartphone? Were you paying on QR codes? What things existed then that perhaps don't exist now as an experience?
It's so funny because I work at the Thunderbird School of Global Management here in Phoenix. We're a global master's program. And I was telling the students about my experience. And the student asked, she's like, well, what would the English level be like, in Beijing today? And I said, honestly, in a big city like Beijing, nearly everyone speaks English, right? But I said, honestly, today with the advances in AI, I'm like, I don't think it matters. I'm like, you can get around so much easier, download DeepSeek, translate conversations. But back then, 2007, I arrived in Beijing with a literal guidebook, like a paper guidebook. We did not have WeChat. The iPhone had not been released yet, so I was on like a tiny Nokia phone. It was very challenging. It was sometimes scary, but fun. Chinese people always made it safe. But the world was very, very different. You would find newspaper stands on every corner, and you could go and buy your China Daily, for example. I think some things still exist. The street life was still very active, people out and about. Chinese people are very healthy and they exercised a lot. But the tech stuff was not there at all. You had to buy a SIM card for your phone, and you went to these newspaper stands to buy a recharge card for 100 kwai. Even that was challenging, but it was still fun.
Yeah. I can't imagine. So I was in China 2013 till about 2019. And one thing that I remember is how to order a taxi changed whilst I was there. When I first arrived, the way you ordered a taxi was you stood on the side of the street and you did that, and you waved the taxi over. And I remember by the time I left, if you didn't have a phone and you didn't have Didi Chuxing or another app with which to order a taxi, there was no way you were standing on the side of the street. So yeah, big changes there. So it brings me on you saying about it being a bit of a challenge when you first arrived to one of the quotes that I really enjoyed from your book, which is you say, the early days in China were a crash course in humility. So I'm wanting to ask you, was there any situations where there was a cultural misunderstanding that led to a deeper connection or a better understanding of China?
I'm a pretty open-minded person, but I do think anyone who arrives in a foreign country or foreign culture, you are bringing your preconceptions from your country, your culture, no matter how hard you try not to, right? And so I can think of a lot of times where I would kind of make a stereotype about a person, or I'll give you an example. The first company I worked in Beijing, it was, I was like me and one other foreigner, right? Everyone else was Chinese. A handful of the staff could speak English, but most did not speak English. And there were these three gentlemen in our office, a little bit older. And my perception of them was they don't speak English. I just felt like they didn't speak English. And then there was this one day we had these rolling power outages in the lead up to the Olympics because they needed to save energy. And we, didn't have computers, nothing to do. These three men come in my office and they start talking to me, not only in English, but this deep conversation about history and Richard Nixon coming to China and Kissinger. And I was just sitting there and I was like, I know nothing. I know nothing, It's the tip of the iceberg. I have been wronged about China so many times. But I never underestimate it. I never doubt the resilience or the creativity or ingenuity of the Chinese people. But it is still a lesson in humility for me all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. There's no end to there's no limit to how much you can learn about it, right? So yeah, I really like that as a quote. That was excellent. So I wanted to come on, you've talked a little bit there about your career. And I think that's one of the most fascinating aspects of who you are as a person and the experiences you've had. I don't think I personally have ever met somebody that's had such a broad range of, globally famous companies that has worked in China. So I'm really excited to ask you about them. So just to say again, you've worked for Disney in China, which is in an interesting place in terms of it's in the movie industry where, there's sometimes a tension perhaps between Hollywood and China in the films that can get released. So I feel like being a bridge between the two countries and helping Disney get its movies out to China is something that's really interesting. You've also worked for CGTN, the state broadcaster, and you've worked for Pearson, which is a publishing company. Is that correct?
Yeah.
So can you talk to us a little bit about those companies, your career, and how it shaped you as a person and as a leader?
I think I've had a very, very lucky career. I just keep looking at some of these jobs I get and I'm like, gosh, I'm so lucky, you know. So the Pearson job, so Pearson is a ginormous British multinational that has a huge imprint in education all around the world. And as I talk about in the book, Beijing Bound, toward the end of my first year, I start teaching English kind of as a hobby. You know, one of my Chinese colleagues said, I think you'd be a great teacher. Why don't you try? I was scared. I'm like, I don't know if I can teach English, but I loved it. You know, all my students were adults. They already spoke English. So for me, it was like I was getting paid just to like chat with them. And this was a chain of schools in Beijing called Dell English. It was owned by a Chinese man who had gotten a medical degree in the US. Dell had some amazing locations throughout Beijing. And then in 2008, Pearson decides, hey, China's growing like crazy. We want to be part of that market. And so they bought Dell English. So for me, it was like right place, right time. I was going from kind of this locally owned school to now this huge British company is taking over. And when Pearson came in, they remodeled all the centers, they brought in their textbooks, they installed like those really smart whiteboards that could connect to the internet. It was very, very exciting and totally unexpected for me. I worked at Pearson for 2 years. And then Disney was really starting to expand in China. Whenever I say Disney, they're like, oh, the park in Shanghai. At that point, they already had plans for the park, but Disney had many business units in China. You were talking about pivoting. That was one of the areas where Disney had to pivot. Disney Store is a retail outlet where Disney sells their shirts, their plushes, all that kind of stuff. Disney had big plans to expand the Disney stores in China. Then they looked at the market. Chinese people like buying a lot of stuff online. They don't always go into stores unless it's maybe for clothing. And so they ended up building a huge Disney store at the Shanghai park. But then most of it, they were like, we're just going to do it online. Huge animation unit wanting to do local Chinese content in Mandarin. We had a chain of English schools called Disney English that grew through a number of cities. Unfortunately, Disney English closed as a result of the pandemic. And then, of course, the park in Hong Kong, the park in Shanghai. Disney owns ABC. So we also supported that. And I was lucky. I got into an HR role there. They wanted someone who had been on the ground, who kind of, spoke a little bit of Mandarin, understood the culture a little bit, because we were going to onboard a lot of foreigners, and we did. And we brought them from everywhere. US, UK, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand. It was a crazy period, but also a very exciting period. And then worked in HR for Disney for 3 years. I thought my time in China might be coming to an end. There's not a lot of HR roles for foreigners in China, right? But I had a friend, a Chinese friend who worked at CCTV. And I thought maybe I could get a job as like a copy editor or something like that. And so I reached out to him. I'm like, hey, I'm job hunting. And he's like, I'll give your resume to the head of HR. And he was very confident. He's like, we look forward to having you join us. And I thought, they're not going to, right? I go in for the interview and I'm like, I've always been a good writer and blah, blah, blah. And then he goes, well, what about HR? You're an HR guy. And I'm like, really? And so I was hired as HR manager, where I was mostly responsible for recruiting expats to come work for us in Beijing. Of all my experiences in China, I was there 7 years. It was really an unprecedented opportunity. I'm very grateful.
Sure. And you got to work in one of the best buildings in Beijing as well, as we've already mentioned. So I think that's really interesting. So when you were working for Disney, it was in a HR role, and you say that you were bringing in lots of foreigners. there is quite a different understanding of HR. Well, I should ask you this. Is there a different understanding of what human relations and HR departments are and the policies they have in China compared to any experiences you've had, in America or the wider Western world?
So that's a great question, actually. I think HR in China, I mean, I'll be honest with you, like in the US, HR is not really respected. It's viewed as more of like an admin role. It shouldn't be like that. HR people really are strategic and they should have a seat at the table. I think in China, HR is the power. Like the HR people really run the company. They advise the senior leaders. They have a lot of say. They have say over who gets hired, who gets terminated. It tends to be more centralized. It was a different model. I mean, I didn't work in HR in the US, but I knew kind of what the HR model was in the States. But the Chinese HR model is quite powerful, quite centralized, very respected.
Sure. And were there differences in terms of, I feel from my experiences, I haven't worked in HR, but obviously I've had a career in the UK and I understand as an employee how I interact with HR. It feels like HR is very policy based. So it's very much there is a document that has been written that is publicly available to both the employee and the HR department. And it's quite bureaucratic in the sense of what is written in that is very much the guidance and the structure in terms of how HR will proceed. And I'm curious whether that's the case in China or whether there's more of a interpersonal and human ability for the HR department to find a solution that suits and they don't have to follow so strictly perhaps written procedure.
It's a great question. I do think HR in China does tend to kind of be policy centric. I think a lot of Chinese HR practitioners would love their employees to come seek them out, ask their advice. I think a lot of employees in China are fearful of HR, to be honest with you. Part of why I think was brought into my role, it wasn't just hiring the expats. It's that we're bringing someone over from a foreign country. Chinese media, the way it operates, the way it runs is different, right? And so I was kind of a bridge where that person from South Africa that just doesn't get it could come and find me and be like, what's going on? Is this normal sort of thing? I hired my first anchor that I hired was from the US. And I told her, she was like a local celebrity in Seattle. Like she went to the grocery store, people were asking her for her autograph, right? And I said, you need to be prepared. When I bring you in this environment, you're nothing. I'm like, your first day, no one's going to even talk to you or notice you. Her second day, we provided, people to stay in a hotel for 30 days. Her second day, she said, yesterday was my first day, and I remember you told me that during the interview. And if you hadn't told me that, I would have thought it was so strange, but you prepared me for that. So that's what I was always trying to do. I never wanted to sell a position. I was honest with people. I'm like, here's what you're going to love about working here. Here's what you're going to hate about working here, as well as the China side. China's not for everybody. You need to be adventurous. You need to be comfortable with ambiguity. And if you're like that, you're going to love China.
Yeah, definitely. I'm curious. So what were some of those things that you said they were going to love? And then also, if you can share them, what were some of the things that you said that they might hate?
So the loving side, I think, for China, making friends, it's such a, Beijing is such a social place, right? There is always something going on. I was going out even on Monday nights, I would get invites to things and never slept, just constantly running around. If you like people, if you like networking, if you like restaurants and just exploring, I think China's for you. I think people struggled maybe a little bit in our work environment, our media environment, in that Chinese companies do tend to have a little bit more hierarchy. And there's not always the thing, like I would organize stuff. I'd be like, okay, let's do a happy hour after work, right? You're not going to find necessarily a lot of those organized things unless it's like a Chinese New Year dinner or something like that, right? So I did have to tell people the way you operate at work will probably be a little bit different from what you've experienced back home. But after a little while, most people were comfortable with that. And I was very proud at CCTV, CGTN. We got most of our employees through their contract completion, which we didn't even do that well at Disney, a very famous American company. Our turnover rate at Disney was very high. At CGTN, by giving people the information up front, we were very successful in that.
Yeah. I think that that's something that I've experienced. You talked about the power dynamic and the power structure. Speaking about the UK, I feel culturally in the workplace, it's quite a flat power structure. And so the way you demonstrate when there's a leader and perhaps somebody a bit lower than them, it can be quite difficult to even demonstrate that within meetings, in the sense of often leaders will be very receptive and very inviting of everybody within the meeting to give their opinions. And there isn't necessarily a structure of how the meeting might follow where the leader first speaks and then invites people. Whereas in China, it might be a little bit more structured, a little bit more ordered, and it's important that you go in order and you give people their right titles and things like that. So I'm curious, when you're working with the foreigners that tend to come over to China, are there any tips that you're giving them in terms of perhaps things that we don't do in the West? Do you have any kind of it's a generalization, so apologies to ask you about it, but things we don't do in the West that Chinese people are particularly good at that they might need to think about?
I think some things are subtle, but like I remember when I worked at Disney, I had a colleague. He was from the northeast of China, good old Dongbei. And I remember whenever he would go on a trip, he would bring back like a snack or a souvenir from that area, and he'd like put it out in the general area with a note, these pineapple cakes are from Hainan province, And then I saw other colleagues doing that too, and I thought that's so thoughtful. Like, your colleagues didn't get to travel, they had to stay and work, they were holding down the fort. But just a small gesture like that wasn't something that I'd ever seen in America, and I thought that was really nice. I think a lot of Chinese, a lot of things in Chinese culture aren't necessarily overt; they're more subtle. But there is a lot of meaning there, asking questions, like if they're inviting you to a meal, do you have allergies? Is there anything you don't like? Just lots of like things that shows they're really thinking about you, that I don't think I live in I don't see a lot of empathy around me right now.
So with us being the Confucius Institute and the host of this event, a big part of what we hope to do is to teach people Mandarin and encourage people for language learning. So I'm curious, what sort of level is your Mandarin at? How has the language learning process been part of your career in China? What are some of the challenges you've faced? Have you got any top tips for language learners?
So I've never taken the HSK. I actually tried researching it when I got back, and I was like, I want to finally get my HSK certificate. I don't think I can find a place in Arizona, sadly. I would guess I'm probably an HSK 4. So kind of that, conversational. I can have some advanced discussions about things like history or maybe HR, but if it's something like finance, I don't have the terminology for that. So 6 months before I moved to China, I really wanted to start learning. And so there was an audio series called Pimsleur, which they still sell. Pimsleur was actually developed for the CIA. And it's based on memory techniques that I got to tell you, I thought they were pretty good. Like those phrases were getting in my head just listening to the CDs in my car. So I did that for like 6 months. Then, of course, you get to China and you're like, oh my God, no one sounds like this. You know, real man is different, right? And of course, Beijing, you know, native Beijingers, you know, the Arhua, you know, it's a little bit different. But then for a few months, I was meeting with language partners, and I loved language partners. Like they became my friends. They were great guides to the culture, but their English was so far advanced than my Mandarin that at a certain point, I was like, this isn't going to teach me Mandarin, right? So during May holiday, I enrolled in a 1 week boot camp at a school called Frontiers. I have to admit, it was overwhelming, like going in every day, like 8 hours of just input, input, input. Then after that, I studied at a place called the Taipei Language Institute, which was in a neighborhood called Dengshiko, which is near Wangfujing. I studied there for a few months, and I had private VIP classes with two different teachers. That helped a lot. And I would also say what I got at TLI, it wasn't even so much Mandarin. They taught me a lot about the culture. And, you know, in English, your aunt is your aunt, your uncle is your uncle, your grandpa is your grandpa. You know, I remember one teacher drew the family tree on the board and he was showing all the words, you know, this is Mei Mei, this is Dajia, and all this. It was overwhelming. And I remember being like, I'm never going to learn this language, right? But it was a good cultural insight. And I'm like, in China and in Asia more broadly, family comes first. Family is important, which is why they've created all these terms for it. So I loved that. Then in 2008, I finally enrolled at Beijing Language and Culture University in Haidian District. That the disadvantage, I was still working. And so I couldn't like focus entirely on my studies. But I would say being in a university environment, that I had an advantage over my classmates because I'd already been in China a year. I could understand the teacher. And I remember an American classmate, he leaned over and he's like, oh my God, you can understand what he's saying. Like the rest of them were like, what? What's he saying? You know? So my listening skills were really good. By the time I left Beijing and Language Culture University, my speaking had really improved too. But it's, you know, Mandarin as a foreigner, it's an ongoing, lifelong journey. There are those few people that just they have that gift, but make it a hobby. Don't stress about it.
Is it something that you're still keeping up with now that you're back in America?
You know, at Thunder, I'm not in classes, and I probably should do that just to keep my edge. But at Thunderbird, 90% of our students are international. I've got students Beijing, Shenzhen, Hong Kong, Taipei, they're from everywhere. So Mandarin is something that we hear in the hallway all the time. So I feel like I'm already in a Mandarin environment, to be honest with you. But yes, I would like to, I need to double down on it.
Is it something that you ever use with the students and perhaps they're not expecting it, not knowing your background? What sort of reaction does that get?
I mean, when they find out my story and that, you know, that I was in Beijing 13 years and I worked in all these companies, it's exciting for them. And I would say even beyond our students from Asia, with so many international students here, they know that I can relate to their struggle. I know what it's like to be an international student. I know what it's like to be an expat. I know the challenges of visas. I know the challenges when governments change rules, you know. So I have that empathy that, not everyone in our faculty or staff has. And I feel lucky to be here and to connect with these students. And I would also say to everyone on the webinar, I am a master networker. Add me on LinkedIn, please.
Yeah, definitely. Glenn, we'll be able to get the link for your LinkedIn after the event, and I'll happily email it to all of the participants today, as well as the video recording of this event. So all of this incredible information that you're receiving, you're going to get a chance to go view it for the second time. So Glenn mentioned there that you are coaching global leaders at the Thunderbird School. So we've got quite a lot of international students that will be on the call today. And we, as a Confucius Institute at Leeds Business School, a lot of the students from an international cohort. So what are some of the top tips you are giving these students when they're looking to go out into the global employment world? It's a bit of a challenge. I know certainly in the UK, the employment market, it's a bit of a challenge in China for young people. I know America economically is doing very well, but I think perhaps employment is a challenge there. So, these tips are needed, really.
It drives us crazy because our international students, when they graduate from Thunderbird, they have US work authorization for 3 years. Trying to explain that to a company, no, you can legally hire this person. They have full US work authorization. It is a struggle. And so one thing we tell our students, network. A lot of people think networking is just adding random people on LinkedIn and sending them a message. It doesn't work. LinkedIn is a tool. It's a research tool. It gives you intelligence, but you got to get out there. You've got to talk to people. You've got to let them know what your situation is, what you're after. For international careers in general, Jack, I agree with you. I think we're still having some ramifications from the pandemic. It's 5 years, but countries are still figuring some stuff out with their employment situation, with their visa situation. We see things opening up in certain pockets like Spain and Portugal. I don't think expat opportunities have fully recovered though. But first and foremost, research. You want to understand what are those countries' visa policies. Do you qualify to even work there? Like you said, China really prefers more experienced professionals with at least 2 years experience to come in and work, right? Figure that part out. Then once you've figured out the country or the countries that you're targeting that you're eligible to work in, then start doing more of a deep dive. Talk to people who are living there, other expats. What are they hearing? What are they seeing? Find the Chamber of Commerce from your country in that area. See what they're hearing. I will say, I think it's with AI and everything like that, you can do so much research. Pop on ChatGPT. What are the visa requirements for Ireland? And then starting from there, and then even figuring out, and I would also bring this up. I did not move to China working for a big company. I worked for a locally owned company, but then I was able to pivot to bigger companies. Don't go in expecting that you have to work for Swire or Cathay Pacific or these kinds of brands. Get your foot in the door, figure out what's going on.
Yeah, I think that's really great advice, especially with China being so far away and a big challenge. I know we've got a lot of UK students as well that are on the call, and they'll be very interested in getting a career in China. So getting a foot in door is one of the best ways to do it, right? Like I say, it's quite far away, China. It's a bit daunting getting over there, and just to begin with is one of the best tips. But what I also want to ask you is, on top of that, you wrote in your book that you've onboarded over 600 expats in China. So would it be remiss of me to not ask your advice for those students that are on the call that are currently doing their undergraduate or doing their masters, who are thinking, I want to go over to China and work there. So what are some of from your onboarding of these 600 people, what are some of the standout traits that you saw, and things that they can think about that they can work on to improve themselves other than just graduating?
You want to be flexible. It's not going to work like your home country. Things are going to be different. I would get nervous if I had, say I was negotiating, someone to join our company. I got really nervous if they started asking lots of questions that I was like, uh-oh, they might be pretty high maintenance, A place like China, if you're going over single without a family, it's a much easier experience, right? When I was onboarding people with families, talking about international schools, talking about international hospitals, all that stuff, it's a very different kind of thing, right? China has a lot of people. What's the population these days? Over 1.4 billion. Being an expat is really a privilege, I think, in a place like China. So remember, they can always find a local to do that job. So if you're interviewing for something, I don't mean to sell yourself short or not think that you're not worth something. But no, they have someone locally that can do it, or they can find another expat who can do it. Come in with the right attitude and come in, if your contract's for a year or if it's for 3 years, come in with a mindset of, I'm going to do this, I'm going to complete it. Think of it as a challenge and have fun along the way.
Awesome. Amazing. So Glenn has answered some questions on his personal introduction, on his book, Beijing Bound. He's answered some questions on on his career experiences at CGTN, and he's given some really useful advice. We've not received any questions yet. So what I'm going to encourage people is, I've got one more section to ask some questions about him. But if anyone does have any questions, just be thinking about those and get them ready for the question and answer session. It's a really unique opportunity to have Glenn with us today. And I think he's got some really valuable insights. So yeah, if you want to get those questions prepared, I want to open now, just go a bit wider and talk a little bit about the future and a little bit about China and America and relations. So what are some of the opportunities or pitfalls that you expect to come up for students in the next 5, 10, 15 years?
Well, I think like we just alluded to in the last segment, right? Immigration, those kinds of things are still very complicated. They're changing all the time, We're seeing international student numbers to the US decline already, and I think that will continue. So I think there will be some of that grappling with immigration things for sure. The other thing that I would say, I feel like parts of the world are getting more international than we even realize. I live here in Phoenix. We have had an explosion in our Asian population. We've got a lot of people moving here from California. California is a great place. Cost of living is pretty high. Phoenix is a little bit cheaper. We've got some Asian companies from Korea, Taiwan moving in. So we're seeing a lot of changes. Even if you can't find your expat job right away, join your local international community. I'm part of a group called Internations. Internations is a networking group from Germany. I used to go to lots of events in Beijing, met a lot of great friends there. Find your local Internations chapter and use it as a networking opportunity. I think if you're, involved with the Confucius Institute, you're already a pretty international person. Immerse yourself in more of that.
Yeah, I would like to highlight that. Definitely one of the best things you can do is get involved with the Confucius Institute, attend all of our events and get involved in our Chinese classes, and also buy, Glenn Loveland's book, Beijing Bound, which is going to give you incredible advice. So yeah, I'd highlight those and reinforce those.
And if you read Beijing Bound, please rate it on Amazon or Goodreads or wherever your local site is. Those rankings are actually quite critical.
Yeah, of course, we definitely will do. So my next question is much wider, much broader. It's not necessarily from your professional experience, but how do you see kind of US-China relations? You yourself are somebody that bridges the two countries and actually offers, professional advice that you're in your new role in terms of coaching, but in your previous roles at these big companies in terms of how foreigners and Chinese workplaces can connect. How do you see the relationship? Is it going to improve? Is it going to get worse? Is it going to stay the same? What's going on with it?
I think it's a good question. I would say this. I feel like this is very much China's moment right now. I think China is leading on the vanguard in so many fronts, from, like I alluded to earlier, clean energy. Um, I will tell you, Chinese soft power in the States is, when I was in Beijing looking at the US just through the media lens, I always felt like, oh, wow, Americans really don't like China and it's a bad time. The opposite is true. I am amazed, especially with young people. They are fascinated by China. So many of my American students, we have a program where we send students abroad. Lots of students want to go to the China one. I think the Chinese government is doing a brilliant job with how they're negotiating with the new Trump administration, Trump 2.0. They learned a lot of lessons from the first time. And the short term, I think it's going to be very messy. They're saying Xi will probably travel to the States around their birthdays. They both have a birthday around the same time. It's going to be ups and downs. China's playing a long game. And, I am not a Trump supporter in any way, shape, or form. And I think China's going to come out ahead long term.
What are sort of some of the cultural soft power pieces that are really breaking through in America? So I know we're getting a lot of news in the UK about a film called, I think it's called Ninja 2. It's not actually come out in the UK, but it's breaking box office records all across the world. Is that coming through in America? Are there any other music, entertainment, games, these types of things?
I read The Guardian, and I have to say I am so jealous because I feel like the UK is so much more receptive and cosmopolitan when it comes to Chinese entertainment. Some of those, like even Chinese indie documentaries or films, if I was living like in a super big city like San Francisco or New York, I'm sure I could find a screening. But in the UK, it's they're very receptive to Chinese pop culture. Here, I wouldn't say it's so much that, but I mean, like, it's so funny to me that TikTok, Chinese owned app, the very first act the Trump administration took, the first act they took was to save the app from closing. And I just thought it's so ironic because, during Trump's first administration, they wanted to ban TikTok. They wanted to ban WeChat. And I was really scared. I was like, oh my God, I'm going to lose all my links to China, right? And now the very first act the Trump team does is save TikTok. But I think even on places like TikTok, you will find Americans teaching Mandarin or talking about Chinese food or introducing cities in China. So there's a lot of things like that. And then I think the Belt and Road Initiative, even though it's infrastructure focused, it means that China is getting out into pockets of the world where they haven't been before and introducing themselves. And like I said earlier, I have a lot of students from Zimbabwe, a lot of African students who got their undergraduate degrees in China. And it's so ironic to me that now we're all sitting here in the desert, and we feel China's influence from here.
Yeah, okay. I've got a tough question for you. I know that you lived, it's not that tough, don't worry. I know that you lived in Beijing. So I'm going to ask you to not answer with Beijing for this one. What was your favorite place to visit in China?
It's so hard. It's really hard. I will say a place that stood out for me was Chongqing. I love Chongqing, and I think it's for a few reasons. One, I love spicy food. Those Chongqing hot pots, a little bit different from the Sichuan style, the Mongolian style. But I love the food. I found the people very cosmopolitan. Parts of Chongqing, it's like a hybrid of like San Francisco, Chicago, the river, the bridges, those bridges are so gorgeous there. I just loved it. I'm a city person, so I like cities. I feel like the right answer is to say Guilin or a place like that. I love Yunnan province as well. But Chongqing was a place that stood out. And I feel like Chongqing is kind of ill-defined for Americans. They don't like they've heard of Chengdu, they've heard of something, but Chongqing is maybe not as well known for them. But Beijing is best.
It brings up a weak spot to me because I have to admit I've traveled to many places in China, many places, but Chongqing is one place that I have yet to been. And I know it's super popular on TikTok at the moment in terms of people taking videos of it. You talk about the infrastructure and the bridges, with it being so hilly. You know, they've got the metro that goes through a building. They've got the beautiful bridge and the just so much like infrastructure to deal with the hilly city. So yeah, I would love to go to Chongqing. It's definitely on my list to go. So that brings me to the final question, and then we're going to open it up, and hopefully we've got some audience participation. I'm sure we'll have some questions from themselves. So it is.
The students can add me on LinkedIn and email me later.
Yeah, if people haven't got their questions ready, they certainly can contact Glenn. As he said, he loves to network. So my final question before I hand over to the audience is, if you were to give your 30-year-old self one piece of advice before boarding the flight for the first time to Beijing, what would it be?
You know, there was when you write a book. This book took me 4 years to write. It was exhausting and long. A lot of stories had to get cut because you have to create a narrative that keeps moving, right? But on the plane flying to Beijing, there was a man from Hong Kong, and this was a China Eastern flight. And back then, people used to stand in the back of the airplane and have conversations. And he's like, I saw you at the airport in LA. And he's like, this is your first time to China, right? And I said, yeah. And he said, I want to give you a piece of advice. He said, China's not like the US. You need to make friends. You've got to make local friends to help you navigate and figure stuff out. And I really took that to heart. And I was like, that's kind of mission number one for me is I need to get out there and meet people. And, Jack, you lived in Beijing. It's like, I love Beijing because it's such a melting pot. You meet people from all over China there, and then they teach you about their local culture and that kind of thing. But I think that was something that I really stuck with me. I feel like before I moved to China, I was like, oh, I better master Mandarin and I better master chopsticks and I better do this. Chinese people don't care about that surface stuff. I mean, they love it that if you make an effort, and you're polite and all that. They really want to get to know you. And I feel another thing I would say too, I feel like at the beginning, I was kind of shy and not super, maybe not authentic. I was like a PR person, so really into image. Chinese people want to get to know you, warts and all, and they don't judge you. I hope.
Lovely. Well, thank you so much. I think that's been a super interesting session, and you've given some really valuable personal insights into what has been an incredible experience in China. I said it at the start, I don't think I've met somebody that has such a broad experience working for such influential companies. And, as you say, you've onboarded so many people. So some great career advice, cultural advice, bridge between America or the Western China advice. So I'm going to open it up and hope that perhaps we've got some questions from our audience now. If they've got any questions, if they want to, you don't have to turn your camera on. You can just unmute your mic and ask Glenn. So yeah, over to you guys. Fingers crossed we get some questions.
Lewis.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello, thank you very much for speaking to us tonight. I really enjoyed the talk. Yeah, I was just noticing because I've been reading sort of articles here in the UK about sort of Chinese graduates, university graduates, and obviously the difficulties in able to finding a job. And I can imagine in China, sort of the vast, amount of competition when you have, thousands of people, applying for, small number of jobs. And I think it sort of mirrors sort of some of the themes that, in the UK as well with the experiences of my peers. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts on that. And I've also got a follow-up question, but I don't know if anybody else wants to answer that question first.
So you're asking what's it like for Chinese, like a Chinese graduate in the US to land a job?
Sorry, what I meant is sort of like, how should I put it? I just saw your general thoughts about sort of like young Chinese people in China, or perhaps maybe, if you've got experience with people, international students in China going to a Western country, that might be better.
Yeah, I would answer it a couple of ways. I think the Chinese economy is undergoing a lot of transformation. They've been wanting to get out of being, the world's factory. We know China is the leader in manufacturing, and there'll always be an element of that. But again, China is doing so much with clean energy, AI, DeepSeek. If you haven't used it, it blows all these other AI tools out of the water. And I know China is now integrating DeepSeek into so many elements of life. China's grappling with what we're all grappling with. The world is changing fast and furious, and we're all trying to figure this out as it goes. The job market, for a Chinese national in China, it's very competitive. It's cutthroat. You've always had to kind of be at the top of the food chain and have good skills and all that, but it is very competitive. I think the advantage is we're starting to see more Chinese people out in the broader world, which I think is great. We need their talent. We need their voices. For an international person wanting to go to China, there's always those niche jobs that are kind of for people from certain countries. You always need a native English teacher or whatever. Those opportunities do exist, but I do think the expat job market overall, broadly, internationally, it's still in a weird space, I would say.
Thank you for that.
Did you have a follow-up? Junie?
Hey, hi, Glenn. Thank you for a wonderful presentation. Your unique insights into the Chinese culture and career development have truly inspired me. And as someone who will soon face the pressure of securing a good job back in China, I find your perspective really valuable and helpful. So I assume that job-related challenges are a major concern for my generation and beyond in China. So I really love to hear your advice on that. Like, given your extensive experience with the Chinese workplace and your international perspective, what do you think are the most important traits or some unique characteristics for the young people in China who are looking for a good job? Thank you.
Yeah, no, I think it's a good question. I will tell you, when I worked at CGTN, we a lot of some of the best journalism schools are in the UK, right? It's kind of the leader in storytelling, BBC, Guardian, all that. I rely on UK news a little bit more even than the Post and the New York Times here, quite honestly. Mm-hmm. We would do these interview panels with these young Chinese graduates who had done these amazing master's degrees in the UK. And then they would come back to wanting to work at CGTN. Mm-hmm. Sometimes your international experience doesn't always translate locally. I'll be honest, I think there can be a little bit of a bias sometimes in China that they think Beida, Peking University, Tsinghua, like these are the top schools, right? And so sometimes they would say to people, well, why did you go overseas? Why didn't you do your degree, here, right? Mm-hmm. Sometimes that bias exists, I think you want to have a story about that. You know, like I chose to go over there because I wanted to learn about this or about that. The other thing I would say with your resume, have a little bit more of a story to tell. You know, show that you did something beyond your academic coursework. We had one of these students, she was Chinese. She'd actually done her journalism degree in the US. And, you know, on WeChat, you can create your own public accounts, right? She created a public account where she reviewed all of these American restaurants in the US, but for WeChat. And I thought to myself, I wish there was something like that that the rest of the world could see, because I thought that was such a cool project. I was like, she was like the Anthony Bourdain of China, you know, but she had only done it for WeChat, so it was kind of locked there. But you know, show your personality, have some good stories about what you chose to do. And you know, I feel like China's the capital of networking. It can't hurt.
Thank you so much, Glenn. Thank you for your advice.
Possible to go to China and start working. Let me pop that open. As an English teacher, as a gateway into other work without having experience in any other fields. This is always a good question, right? It's easy to get pegged sometimes as, oh, you're an English teacher, right? I think the advantage I had when I moved to China, I was older. I was not a fresh graduate. I moved there when I was 31. And I had like really good professional experience, right? So my experience is a little bit different. I think if the job market is going crazy and you want to teach as a gap year, I think that's totally fine. I think the mistake a lot of people make with their CV and their resume and their LinkedIn, they think they have to tell everything on that document. You do not have to tell everything on that document. That document is a marketing document. The idea is to get you an interview, to show that you're an interesting person, right? If you're having a struggle landing a full-time job that you really want, going and teaching English for a year is really not a bad strategy, because while you're doing that, get a side hustle going. Start a side hustle related to the job that you really want. Here, Phoenix sister cities. One of Phoenix sister cities is Chengdu in Sichuan. They also have a sister city in Japan, and a sister called Heimeiji. They have a relationship with an English teaching program in Heimeiji, where when you go over there, you're actually working for the city of Phoenix, and they really take good care of you. Find out whatever city you're in, your hometown or Leeds, wherever, find out where your sister cities are and explore relationships there, because that's a very safe, easy way. But you got to have a side hustle. You're not just teaching English. You're not just doing, you know, we're all doing a lot of things now. Inflation is real. Oh, Junie, did you have another?
Oh, sorry, I think I pressed it wrong. Oh.
Okay. Linda.
Yes, I have a question. And previously, I discussed with Jack also about the over competition or hyper competition among the Chinese young colleagues. And sometimes it's in China we call it 卷, which means that we compete with each other. And then, so do you think that we can have better solutions or suggestions for the Chinese co-workers, or as a foreigner integrate into the Chinese workplace and the culture? What do you think would be the best practice for you to work with the colleagues? Thank you.
I think it's great. I think that, every company, there's not just one company culture in China, right? Every company, every organization has their own feeling, their own thing. Figure out what's going on with the culture, see what the norms are, but also feel like you can be authentic and that you can bring yourself to work. And, like I mentioned earlier, with the example with Jack, like my colleague at Disney would bring back those snacks whenever he traveled. And I thought that was such a nice gesture. There is a lot of competition in China for sure. But I also think when I was working at Disney, our director of finance, she was this very hardworking lady from Tianjin. Her name was Grace. And I never felt like Grace ever really noticed me. She took the train in every day from Tianjin and then went home. And she said to me one day in the taxi, she said, "You are the hardest working foreigner I've ever worked with." And I was like, really? But it was true. At Disney, I worked a lot of times pretty late and things like that. Even if you don't feel like you're appreciated or people are noticing, they're noticing. But I think in Chinese culture, sometimes those kinds of conversations are not real. That's not very common. Even performance evaluations. There was one year at a company, they left my performance evaluation on my desk instead of talking to me about it.
That's good. Yeah, I have a follow-up question. Sometimes when you work in the Chinese company, so how to better balance the work life? And do you think that is very good? Any suggestions for work-life balance? Because you are also very prolific in terms of writing, and then also in terms of your working in Disney, etc. How to manage the time and then to ensure that you get your hobby of writing and at the same time working diligently? How to balance these time management items? Yeah.
I know there have been a lot of stories, in the media. There's some industries in China that 996 culture is really getting there. The overtime culture, it's real. There's a lot of, and I feel like it's kind of everywhere these days. The thing I would say, if there's something that you really want to do, you've got to make time for it. And when I started writing this book, when I first moved to the States, I didn't have a job, right? I didn't have a job for a few months. So that was easy because then I was like, well, writing will be what I do. Then I started working. And then I kept thinking, oh, I need to find time to write. You're never going to find time to write. And so it was like, I either have to wake up earlier or I have to stay up later. I gained a lot of weight writing this book because I was like staying up till midnight and writing and editing and all that kind of stuff. If it's something you really want to do, carve out time. When Anthony Bourdain wrote his first memoir, he was working in a kitchen. He was a chef. He was basically waking up at 4 a.m. every morning and then writing for an hour before he went to work. So I don't think the pressure is going to go away for any of us, especially with the way that AI is disrupting everything. But let's just do our best. Louis?
Hey, yeah, just jumping back in with a few more questions. I think you sort of alluded to throughout your talk about sort of the optimism throughout your time whilst in China, particularly surrounding the Olympics. And I was just wondering, because now, obviously, in terms of sort of the global, sort of, there seems to be a lack of sort of optimism currently in terms of cooperation between countries and sort of the Western sort of perception with China. Do you feel sort of confident that, or can you foresee a moment in the future where we can sort of have sort of a better relationships, or we would gain some of that optimism?
Yeah, I would say this. Countries are dynamic, and especially China. China changes all the time, you know, and whatever those relations look like right now. I mean, I look really at the pivot I've seen since Trump came back here, and I just the way that China is very appealing to people, and people are looking at China in a new eye. I think it's very hopeful. So I don't think anything is static. The 2008 Olympics were a unique time, undoubtedly. When I moved to China, all my friends thought I was crazy. They were like, oh, wow, Glenn lost his mind. He moved to China, right? After the opening ceremony broadcast in the US, I woke up the next morning, my email, my Facebook, they were like, China looks amazing. You are so lucky to live there, you know. It's things pivot all the time, but I'm optimistic about the long-term trajectory.
Yeah, thank you. And if I can sort of have another question, yeah, talking a bit more sort of personally about your experiences. Do you notice a sort of a change in which, like, how people in China sort of interacted with you? I think you alluded sort of when you sort of started, you know, in working in China, there was no, you know, WeChat, there's no, you know, iPhones and stuff like that. And then and when I went to China, to Beijing quite recently, you can only see people sort of on their phones, you know. So do you notice sort of like a difference in sort of the way people interact, or do people went about their lives, or even just more interactions with you?
That's a great question. I do think, I'm sure technology has changed a lot. I will be honest, I think I was lucky. I mean, China pretty much from day one rolled out a red carpet for me. And I really, negative experiences, few and far between for me, which was very lucky. I will say, the South China Morning Post recently wrote an article about me, and it was about when I moved to China in 2007. And I posted it on my LinkedIn and my Facebook and stuff. And I had a few friends who are still in China, foreigners, and they messaged me and they were like, wow, that period that you described sounds really different. You know, my feeling maybe right now, I think Chinese people were really interested and enamored of foreign people during the period I worked there and lived there. And I think, you know, China, there was a little bit of nationalism, patriotism there. And, you know, China's kind of like, well, what else we don't think we have a lot to learn from some of these other countries. So there's probably a little bit of that. But I do think if you seek people out on a one-on-one basis, it's still there. You just have to be maybe a little bit more aggressive. I'm guessing from your last name, you know, maybe you have Asian features. You have to kind of go out and introduce yourself to let people know, you know, hey, this is, and by the way, I love your accent, great accent. But you have to let people know, you know, who you are, why you're there, what you're doing. But yeah, that question is interesting though. I think everyone's looking at their phones too much these days. I'm like, get out, network, go to happy hour, go to the pub.
Thank you for complimenting my accent. I'm born and bred Londoner, but my parents were born in Vietnam. Yeah, I'm just only asked that question because I think I can imagine like people like in the West just using Instagram and YouTube to know about other countries. So I'm guessing my guess would be like in China, and maybe there's a lot of people, students in China in foreign countries, so there's less
Yeah.
And
No,
if
I
that
think,
that would be my sort of guess.
yeah, I mean, I think another thing I would say about my difference between 2007 versus today, back in 2007, even Chinese brands like Li Ning, the shoemaker, the athlete wear, right? Li Ning's DNA, it wasn't that strong, right? It was like, okay, they're looking at Adidas, they're looking at Nike, and they're trying to create a Chinese version. Today, Chinese brands, I think, are on the vanguard. Like Jack mentioned, Chinese movies, Chinese music. I mean, three body problem that got, a lot of awards and interest. So I think that part of what it is, the shift has the shift has changed a little bit where it's like maybe people aren't as outward looking, but I don't think it's an anti thing at all. It's just it's a little bit of a shift.
Yeah.
Thank you,
yeah.
Alois.
Oh, thank you so much for answering my questions.
Ning, did you have something or she just turned her camera on? Okay. Well, I just want to say again, Linda, Jack, Confucius Institute, this has been an honor. This is the first event I have given about the book, and I'm just, it's so exciting for me and very honored. And let's do something in the future. I can come back. We could do a session on careers. I'm a senior career coach. We could talk about LinkedIn and resumes and stuff like that, especially since people are clearly about, job hunting.
Yeah, Ming just opened her mic. Hi, Ming. Oh, we cannot hear you.
Oh, we can't hear you, Min.
We can't hear you. Sorry, but you can put in the chat if you want to type something. Yeah, so your microphone seems to have some problem. Thank you so much, Glenn. Yeah. Wonderful presentation.
Yeah, just to say, Glenn, yeah, thank you so much for having us. So Beijing Bound, A Foreigner Discovers China is your first book, and we shall certainly be sending out, I've seen it's on Amazon. So in the follow-up to this event, we'll be sending out the Amazon link, if that's okay with yourself. Perfect.
And talk to your local bookstores. Say this guy knows Beijing, get his book in.
We certainly will do. And I know when we spoke to you before everyone joined that you've enjoyed the process and you're actually writing your second book. So I think there's scope for us to do future events, your careers talk, as you discussed, LinkedIn, resume, that type of thing. But when the next book comes out, you'll certainly be back. So I don't know if Min did have a question, whether she was writing it in the chat. Have we got one?
No, she said thank you.
She said thank you very much. So what I'm going to do then is last chance for questions. And if not, I'm going to bring today's event to a close. Linda, was there any final comments you wanted to make as director of Confucius Institute?
I really appreciate today's presentation, and thank you so much, Glenn, for your tips and suggestions. Very, very useful and helpful to our colleagues and students. Many students, they are looking into the future career development. And as you mentioned, that career development is a very good topic. Maybe next time we can invite you for another chat with our colleagues and the students, and both Jack and I, and we have other Confucius Institute colleagues, Xiaolong and Jingyi, Jingjing, all our colleagues are very happy to have you here with us, and thank you so much for everybody come to join us. Yeah.
Thank you again. Truly an honor, and have a wonderful evening, and I can't wait to come back.
Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for attending as well. It's been a pleasure to have everyone. I am going to end the session there. Thank you so much. If any of you did miss any of the incredible information that was released during this event, it has been recorded and we will be placing it on our YouTube, Confucius Institute, Leeds Confucius Institute YouTube account. So you will be welcome to go and view it there. And I will send that link also with the link for Glenn's book, which I'm sure you will be going out and buying. But if not, I'm going to wish everyone in the UK a happy Thursday evening. What time is it where you are, Glenn?
It is 12:24. It's lunchtime. So
Okay, a happy lunchtime to Glenn, and anyone that's calling in from any other country, whatever time it is where you are. I'm going to wish you a happy time. So I shall leave it there.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, Glenn. Thank you, Linda. Thanks
Thank
for
you,
everyone for
Glenn.
attending. And we'll see you all at the next event.
Yeah. Ming is from UCL. Yeah, wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us. See you next time. Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
bye.
Bye-bye. 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 Thank you.